Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to our Android meetup. My name is Petr Nohejl and today I will talk about MVVM architecture on Android. And before we start, I would like to ask you a couple of questions. Who of you has some experience with MVVM architecture? Okay, about 10 people. What about MVP architecture, model view presenter? Okay, it's more, like maybe 20 people. And who of you has some experience with data binding library from Google? Yeah, maybe about 15, 20 people. Okay, so today I will tell you some theory about MVVM. Then I will tell you or show you how to implement it on Android. And then I will show you some example code. So let's get started. MVVM was introduced by Microsoft in .NET Technologies, and it was introduced in 2005. And MVVM is also known as Model View Binder, and it's an architectural pattern which has three layers. It's a model which is responsible for data, view which is responsible for UI, and view model which is responsible for presentation logic and a state. And if you check this diagram, you can see the relations between those layers. Okay, so now I will tell you more about model. Model represents a data provider. It operates with data, and those data can be retrieved from different sources, like, for example, REST API, database, preferences, etc. View. View represents UI components, and the main role or the main purpose is to display the data on a screen. And view model represents a display logic, and is basically a bridge between view and model. And view model prepares the data for presentation, and the important thing is that it uses observer pattern to notify about changes. So if there is some change in the view model, view model notifies a view about that change, and it's displayed. It can be tricky to understand what exactly is the view model. And when I was learning about MVVM, I have read a lot of blog posts, and I found these definitions, so I will just read it. View model is abstraction of the view exposing public properties and commands. View model is state of the data in the model. View model maintains the state of the view, and the last one I like this. It's that view model is basically a value converter, which converts raw data to presentation-friendly properties. So now let's compare MVVM and MVP. So there are some differences. The main difference is that MVVM uses binding, and MVVM is basically an event-driven architecture. So for example, I have some data, and those data are changed. So view model notifies the view, and view displays those changes. There is another difference that MVP uses one-to-one relation, but MVVM uses one-to-many relation. I mean relation between view and presenter, and between view and view model. And it means that many views can be mapped into one view model in MVVM. And another difference is that in MVVM, view has a reference to the view model, but view model has no idea about the view. Now let's talk about some motivation. Why should I try MVVM? Why should I give it a chance? So there are three main reasons. We want to make our code easily maintainable and testable. And it's good to split the code into some smaller components. And it's easy with MVVM because we have three layers which are strictly separated. And also MVVM is well compatible with solid principles. Do you guys know what is solid principles? Have you read about it? Yeah. So solid principles were introduced by Java guru Uncle Bob. It's the guy on the screen. And it's about 5 basic rules of object-oriented programming. I will mention some of those rules later in my presentation. So now let's think about how to implement MVVM on Android. I've seen many different implementations, and I've read many blog posts and saw many examples, and I realized that everybody implement MVVM differently on Android, and maybe it's because MVVM was introduced in .NET technologies and it's not so compatible sometimes with Android architecture. So there are some problems, and we have to solve them, and different people solve those problems differently. I will talk about it later. So I realized that there is no golden rule how to implement it on Android. Everybody does it differently, and even in STRV we use 2 different approaches. So in my presentation I will talk about my personal approach, how I prefer to implement it on Android. So how to implement a binder? There are basically 2 approaches how to implement a binder. It's data binding library from Google, and it's RxJava. I like both approaches, but I personally prefer data binding because I think it's probably easier to use and it has nice API, so it's very well compatible with MVVM. So how to implement layers, model, view, and view model. Model is represented by some data provider. So for example, for REST API, it could be, we can use, for example, retrofit library. And view, we will be implemented by activity or fragment and XML layout. And view model will be plain Java, or it will extend base observable from data binding library. And if we split the code into these 3 layers, we accomplish the first rule of solid principles. It's a single responsibility principle. It means that one class or one component should has only one responsibility. So now let's talk about responsibilities. So model responsibility is to operate with data. We can use libraries or technologies like, for example, retrofit, SQLite database, Realm database, Firebase, and model is also responsible for working with shared preferences, geolocation, or handling broadcast, and any other source of data. View is responsible for handling UI components. It means that Vue is working with Android.Vue package, Android.widget package, etc. Vue is also responsible for showing dialogues, toasts, snack bars, and so on. Vue handles event listeners. Vue is also starting activities, is responsible for handling menu, handling permissions, and other Android-specific stuff and Android APIs which require activity context. Now let's talk about view model responsibilities. So view model is responsible for exposing state. For example, it can be progress, offline, empty state, error state, or any other states we can think about. View model is also responsible for exposing data. It's responsible for handling visibility of UI components. Is responsible for handling extracts and arguments, and it's also responsible for input validation. It means, for example, when user input some email, view model will check the email and check if it is valid or not. And view model also is executing data calls in the model, and it's also executing UI commands in the view. This means that view model is executing methods in the view for showing, for example, dialog or toast, etc. Okay, now let's think about abstraction. To achieve really clean architecture, it's the best you can do is abstract everything. You use abstraction for everything. So for example, you can use command pattern. If you want to abstract event listeners, you can use navigator pattern as an abstraction for navigating between screens. You can use repository pattern as an abstraction for some data provider, and so on. But I think that it's important to find some balance between abstraction and simplicity, because more abstraction we have, also more cleaner code we have. But on the other hand, our code or our architecture will be more complex. So we have to find some balance. I think that for small application, it's better to keep it simple and don't use too much abstraction. And for bigger projects and bigger applications, it makes sense to use abstraction. It's a good practice to use dependency injection, of course. With this pattern, it's easy to mock your dependencies and write unit tests. So for example, in your view model, you can inject some dependencies like in this example. And when we follow, if we follow this pattern, we accomplish the fifth rule of solid principles. It's dependency inversion. And dependency inversion principle means that we should depend on abstractions, and our code should not depend on concretions. Okay, so what about Android APIs? So I think I prefer to have view model just a pure Java, and to keep view model separated from Android APIs. So for example, permissions, intents, menu, and other Android APIs are implemented in activity or fragment, and our view model is pure Java. But there is a problem. What about to separate UI code from Android code? Because, for example, we have an activity with Android methods like onCreate options menu, etc. But we also have our UI code like show dialog or on item click. So it could make sense to separate it, but as I said before, I prefer to keep it simple. So I usually don't separate it in my applications, and I keep UI stuff and Android stuff in one class in activity or in a view. Now let's talk about context. In our applications, we usually use activity context or application context. Activity context can do basically everything, but application context cannot do three things. Application context cannot show a dialog, cannot start an activity, and cannot inflate a layout. But all these three operations are part of the view. It's not part of the view model. So we can say that we don't need activity context in our view model. We can just use application context and we are able to do everything we need. So I prefer to use only application context in my view model and don't use activity context. And it's good because it's more safe and I cannot leak context if I'm not careful. Okay, now let's talk about event listeners. I prefer to have event listeners defined in the view because I think, or my opinion is that, for example, on-click event is part of UI and then it should be implemented in a view. And I would like to show you an example. Imagine we have an application. We have 3 screens and we are loading data on different actions, and we will use the same view model for those 3 activities. Activity 1 will load data when I click on a button. Activity 2 will load data when I confirm some dialog, and activity 3 will load data when some geolocation callback will respond. So I think it does not make sense to implement on refresh button click or on dialog positive click in a view model, and it's better to implement those event listeners in an activity, because those methods will then just call load users. And if I would implement it in a view model, some of those methods could be empty because I don't need them for some specific cases. So if I follow this idea or this pattern, I accomplish the 4th rule of solid principles and its interface segregation. And it means that no client should be forced to depend on methods it does not use. Now let's talk about expressions. Data binding library provides very good expression language. We can use in our layouts conditions, comparisons, we can call methods and stuff like that. So I think that this expression language is quite powerful. And we can do a lot of things with this expressions language. And I think it's not so good. Do you have some idea what is wrong about this piece of code in relation to MVVM architecture? Any idea? Yes, so my opinion is that this breaks single responsibility principle, because this piece of code does 2 different things. It's basically displaying data, and there is also some presentation logic. So I prefer to implement the logic in a view model and then just expose some property which will be binded in the layout. I think it's a better way. But on the other hand, as I said before, I prefer to keep things simple. So in some cases, I think that primitive expressions are probably okay, and we can use them to keep it simple. But I think that our views should be as dumb as possible. What about testing? Our model and view model are separated from Android API. It's a pure Java, so it's very easy to use JUnit and Mockito for our tests. And for a view, we can use Espresso because our view is very dumb. There is almost no logic, so it makes sense to use Espresso framework for testing our views. Yeah, and now let's think about some advantages and disadvantages of this approach. So I think that this approach is or the code is well readable, is well maintainable and testable. We follow solid principles, and we don't have got classes with too much responsibilities because our architecture is separated, or our code is separated into the layers. But there are also some disadvantages. One of the disadvantage is that our view has two parts, Java and XML layout. But as you know, we cannot do anything with that because that's how Google designed Android. So our view has two parts. And there is another disadvantage. It's that we mix Android API and the view into one class, into the activity. But as I said before, I prefer to keep my architecture or to keep my code simple. So that's some compromise. And that's it. Now I will show you some example code. It will be a very simple example just to show you how I implement it. So imagine we have an application. It's a simple application for showing some information about stocks. For example, Walt Disney Company. There is a button on the top. It's a refresh button. There is some title, some chart, and some other info. So how to implement this with MVVM? So I will define an interface. It will be called stock detail view, and there will be one method. It's called on button click. This is basically a callback. When I click on the button, this method will be called from the XML layout using data binding library. There is also there is one issue because as I said before, MVVM has a rule or idea that view model has no idea about the view. But if I use this interface, I basically have an access to the view, and it's because when I use MVVM, everything should be done via binding. But in Android, it's not possible, for example, to show dialog in XML. So that's why I need this interface, because I need to inform my view that I want to show some dialog, for example. It's not possible to implement it via XML. So then I have a fragment. It's a view in MVVM architecture, and this fragment, stock detail fragment, will implement stock detail view. I have one field. It's a binding, and in onCreate view method, I will set up this binding, and I will set two variables. I will set a view and a view model. And then you can see that I implemented the on button click event, and when user click on the refresh button, I will call get view model, and I will load some data. I will call load stock method. This is just a simple example, and some code is missing there because I just want to make it simple in this presentation. But I use a library to handle or to implement MVVM. I will show you later which library I use. So this code, this example is not complete. It's just some pseudocode or something. So now let's check XML layout. You can see that I defined two variables, view and a view model. And for button, I will use onClick property, and I will access my view and call the onButtonClick method. And for a text view, I will, because I want to show a title of the stock, I will access my view model, which expose the data, and I will just render the text. And view model, it has two observable fields. It's a state and a stock. It's some data entity. And there is also some data provider. It's a good idea to inject this data provider, and it represents a model. And in onStart method, I will check if I already have the data loaded, and if not, I will load it. And the load stock method is checking if I'm online or not. If I'm online, I will set some progress state, and I will access my model, and I will load the data. Yeah, so that's just a basic example. I have implemented a more complex example. It's you can find it on this link, and if you want, you can check it out. I used many different technologies like MVVM architecture, data binding, recycle view, RxJava, retro lambda, OK HTTP, retrofit JSON, Glide, and the Canary. So you can, if you are interested, you can check it out, and you can see how these technologies works together. Of course, I will share these slides later. This is just some links to libraries and examples. I use the first library from InLoop. It's called Android View Model. It's quite a good library, and the main purpose of this library is that it handles the orientation change. So it's great that my view model is persisted when I rotate my phone. And there is another great library. It was created by our colleague Kuba Kinst. It's a basically fork of the first library, and Kuba added some other functionalities. So you can also check it out. And there are some other examples and libraries. I have read a lot of articles about MVVM because at the beginning I was very confused and I didn't know how to implement it. So I was interested in how different people implement it. So this is just articles which I have read, and I've also seen some interesting talks. So if you are interested in MVVM, you can check it out. So that's all from my side. Do you have some questions? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, command pattern is basically a pattern from .NET architecture. And I mention it because MVVM is inspired, or it was introduced by Microsoft. Yeah. And you can use command pattern as an abstraction of event listeners. So basically, maybe I can show you later some example because it's difficult to describe it how to implement it. But you can think about command pattern as an abstraction for event listeners. Yeah. Any other question? Uh-huh. You mean the demo application? I started before, I don't know, 6 months, and it's still in progress because I'm interested how people implement it, and I get inspired from people, and I'm trying to improve it and make it good because I use this approach which I have described in my applications. So it's something in progress, you know. uh, yeah, it helps you to implement your application faster, I think, because it's better for maintaining your project, because you implement something and then your client tell you that he wants to change some functionality, and with this architecture with MVVM it's much simpler to do some changes, because you have separated your UI and your business logic. So for example, when client wants to change just some UI thing, something, some design, or I don't know, something, you just change the view layer. It's easier to maintain it. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. Google, for which versions of an Android is Android data binding library supported? For from which version of Android? Do you know? I'm not sure either. Yeah, there is no limitation. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Uh-huh. I don't think it's bad, but it has some disadvantages. I would put it into the view model, like if to show it or not, and then I will just access some property from my layout. It could be just boolean property, you know. So because there was a condition, if this, do this, or do this. So I think this condition is better to implement in a view model, and don't put it into the layout, because it's some logic. You cannot unit test it. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much. Maybe we can. Uh-huh. That's perfectly fine. I just meant that it could be, I don't know, it like the view layer has two parts. It's Java and XML. It would be great to have it just one code. You know, it's not disadvantage. It's not a problem. It's just how Android works. But you know, it has two parts. So no, I don't know. You can implement your UI by a code. You don't have to use XML layouts, but it's better, right? So yeah, yeah. Okay, so we can discuss it later in the scroll bar. So thank you very much for your attention, and that's it.